Right, well, thank you, Eamon, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's a testimony to the interest and the importance of the decade of centenaries and the events of 100 years ago, that everyone is getting so engaged with these. And it's also quite nice to talk about something that's not the Titanic for a moment. When I chose this title, Our War, it was really borrowing from a book which comprised the Thomas Davis lectures a few years ago for RTE, which investigated and explored Ireland's engagements with the First World War. And the title was picked specifically to be a kind of pot-stirring, to be a provocative title. And the interesting thing was that nobody at all was provoked by it. They all sort of nodded and said, yes, we're all engaged in this. Whereas 20 years ago, if you had asserted that it was our war, all people in Ireland, unionists and nationalists, had a direct interest in the war, you would have, fights would have broken out one sort or another. But we'll hear later from Jim, very interesting work, recovering those lost histories from parts of Belfast's population. And the thing about, I have some slides. I'm always a bit surprised. You see what that turns up. But I'm going to give you a few snapshots of the war. I'm not going to give you the whole description. You can get that in books and in other places. But just to say a few things about the war. It's a war that reaches places that other wars had not reached before. It's the first total war, really, in Europe. It's an extraordinary experience which sucks in whole nations and communities. It sucks in civilians as well as soldiers. It sucks in women as well as men. And in Ireland, it touches really every part of the nation and the community. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about recruitment, about who joined up and why. What I want to. Now here, this is of course arguably or assertedly the most famous poster of the 20th century, which exists a lot. Kitchener, born in Kerry, more or less by accident. He's not really Irish, what happens at the beginning of the war is this extraordinary mobilization of public opinion behind the war effort, which stretches to Ireland as much as it occurs in Britain, in England, Scotland and Wales. And what we do know is that about 200,000 perhaps 210,000 Irish men, mostly men, or almost entirely men, serve in the armed forces during the First World War. Now, they fall into three main categories. There are those who are already in the army at the beginning, there's about 50,000 of those. Then there are Kitchener's men, the guys who join up, who respond to the urgent call for volunteers, which we see here from this famous poster. Between August 1914 and February 1916, more or less when conscription's adopted in Britain but not in Ireland, about 95,000 men join up. Thirdly, there are those who join up in the rest of the war. In a way, I'm particularly interested in these people. Between February 1916 and November 1918, you've got about 45,000 Irishmen joining up, including nearly 10,000 recruits in the last 3.5 months of the war alone. Now, what we know, the received wisdom, every program you've ever seen about the First World War depicts that rush to the colours, the war fever in 1914, crowds of men trying to join up. And in a way, you can understand that happening. What seems to me very important to try to explain, and I'm not sure I know the answer to it myself yet, is why people are still joining up 4 years later in very considerable numbers. In fact, recruitment in Ireland goes up a bit in 1918. You'd expect it to have disappeared almost completely by then. And unless we can understand why people joined up in those last 3 months of the war, we'll never understand why they join up at all. And of course, these figures don't include all the Irish people who join up. There are many Irish people from the diaspora, from Australia, from Canada, from New Zealand. I have 4 great-uncles who served in the First World War, 5 great-uncles who served in the First World War, every single one of whom had emigrated to Canada before 1912. And they don't appear on some of the statistics, though it seems to me they're as Irish as many other people. But you can break down the statistics. I'm going to give you and bear with me, I'll not do this for very long. Some facts. I'm a historian. We have to deal in facts. But a little bit about recruitment. And what we've got here is the statistics by location and by religion. Not quite for the whole war. These figures only go to January 1918 because we only have them broken down in this way for that, so they don't match the figures I've already given you precisely. But what these figures show overall is firstly that more Catholics than Protestants, and hence we can assume, though wouldn't make too easy an assumption about this, more nationalists than unionists join up in Ireland during the First World War. And that's sometimes a surprise. Only in Ulster, 9-county Ulster, does the number of Protestants exceed the number of Catholics. Now, these figures, however, are largely meaningless without some idea of the proportionality of enlistment. And my next table shows the recruiting response as a proportion of the religious group, again by province and again over the period from the start of the war to January 1918. And you've got the percentage of the population first and the percentage of the recruits second. And what these figures show us, as we might expect, is that overall a higher percentage of Protestants join up than Catholics. All right, Unionists are more likely to join up than Catholics. In Ulster, for example, where the population is just over half, the 9-county Ulster, half Protestant, nearly 3/4 of all the recruits come from that section of the population. But in the other provinces, the figures are by no means so clear-cut. In Munster and Connaught, they're more or less equal. But in Leinster, oddly enough, Catholics are more likely to join up than Protestants. And what this says, I'm not going to extract anything more from these figures, but what it means is you cannot easily come to any simplistic conclusions about which group is more likely to join up than the other. The easy assumptions we might have in our experience from 100 years perspective are undermined by the actuality of the facts. Now, to put the numbers into some sort of context, we can relate the 200,000 odd to the total number of young men living in Ireland at the time. And if you'd calculate the proportion on the 1911 census, about 700,000 men between the ages of 15 and 35 lived in Ireland. And the great majority of recruits fall within that sector between 15 and 35, not quite all. But you can say that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the available young men on the island, strikingly high proportion, joined up to serve in the First World War. And of those who enlisted, many did not return. The casualty statistics are as imprecise as those for recruiting. We can end up, it's a kind of fool's errand to try and produce real precision from these figures. But we can say that something over 30,000 men with certainty did not return, and certainly perhaps more, which means that the First World War not only reaches parts that other events didn't reach, but also it is the greatest demographic catastrophe to hit Ireland since the famine. A whole swathe of people are cut down. Now, why did these people go is a kind of perennial question, the conundrum of recruitment. I have yet another picture to show you first. I promised my friend Hugh O'Neill a picture of a chaplain. I would entitle this picture Church and State in Modern Ireland. Or in early 20th century Ireland. What you've got on the left here is Father Brown, the famous photographer. He's the man who was on the Titanic from Southampton to Cove before he was summoned off, with his uncle, his brother beside him in the middle, and his uncle, the Bishop of Cloyne, sitting there. Brown went on to be a chaplain with the Irish Guards and took wonderful photographs along the Western Front. And again, that subverts some of our perceptions we might have of joining up. Now, one reason people joined up was the notion that it was right to do so. I think we have to be a bit careful about being too patronizing about the past, and that when we see the terrible things that happened to people who joined up, we think they must have been fools and those famous words of Tom Kettle, fools like this fool, and now with the foolish dead. And sure, they were, we feel, misled into an experience which very few anticipated. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the decisions made for recruiting are not, again, simple or simplistic, though many people thought it, again, was the right thing to do. The issue given at the time, here's a recruiting pamphlet from very early in the war, was that the obligation of Irishmen, remember Belgium, enlist now and defend yourselves, it says. And here was the militaristic, aggressive, imperialistic Germany laying waste to civilians, to women and children in Belgium, breaking the rules, and that it was appropriate for Ireland to go to the aid of gallant little Belgium. And indeed, for many Catholics in Ireland, gallant Catholic little Belgium was part of the the appeal. I used this on the cover of a book I published 10 or 12 years ago. The publisher was a bit anxious about using it because he thought it would restrict sales in Germany. But there you are, we managed to get away with it. But this was an appeal, a really quite important appeal, as it went through. And certainly the available manpower in Ireland, in many respects, was already militarized, was already disposed to join up into armed forces for political ends. And of course, going to war is state violence for a political end. This is John Redmond inspecting members of the Irish Volunteers, who had, of course, organized themselves in conscious imitation of the Ulster Volunteers to support Home Rule. And what David Fitzpatrick, the historian at Trinity College Dublin, has discovered is that individuals, either unionists in the Ulster Volunteers or nationalists in the Irish Volunteers, were themselves more likely to join up in the autumn of winter of 1914 than other sorts of people. So in a kind of odd way, those people who are most committed to nationalism, by and large, there's an extreme separatist wing, do not subscribe to this, but by and large, the more committed nationalists who'd already joined the Irish Volunteers joined the British Army more readily than their non-militarized colleagues. And the same, and there's the proportions of Irish volunteers and Ulster volunteers joining up are strikingly similar. Now, after the war, these guys who joined up then had to try and explain, when they came back to an Ireland that was very different, they had to explain why, or to find some reason why they'd gone away to fight. And you find some clues to these on those monuments that stand about the landscape in Ireland commemorating men of the war. This is the famous one in Cork, put up by a nationalist ex-servicemen's association, the Cork Independent Ex-Servicemen's Club, not the British Legion. And what's the explanation they produce on St. Patrick's Day 1925, when they dedicate this memorial, is they went in memory of their comrades who fell in the Great War fighting for the freedom of small nations. So they're suggesting in 1925 that they were fighting for freedom of small nations, with which they might have suggested Ireland as well, which was part of Redmond's appeal for people to join up. It's Ireland's obligation to join up as well as Britain's. But there are other reasons why people join up. Here's the famous picture of the Dublin Pals on the grounds of Lansdowne Road. The Aviva Stadium's very different today. But these were the footballers. Colonel Browning, F.H. Browning, who's the president of the Irish Rugby Football Union, said, "Come along, lads, this is going to be like a great international fixture, and we don't want to miss this." There's also that sense of exhilaration. This is the dangerous sports clubs. These are young men. These are the guys who drive motorbikes motorbikes and their mothers mad with worry. And suddenly it's legitimized doing this adventurous stuff. Oh, we're proud of you, lad. There's an irresistibility to this as well. And here they are marching off past, suitably, what was then the Kildare Street Club, bastion of unionism in Dublin, and now the Alliance Française. They're going off to fight by the sides of the French. So there's a strange sort of symmetry to that. This is Carson inspecting the Ulster Volunteers to remind us that, of course, their commitment to the Union, the moment of delivery to that commitment comes in August 1914 and September 1914. Although Carson wants to negotiate the commitment, he claims he's not going to set up any conditions, but in fact, he wants, as does Redmond, he wants a specifically local identifiable unit, and this emerges as the 36th Ulster Division. In the rest of Ireland, you've got the 16th Irish Division, which is sometimes known as Redmond's Pets. And then there's another division, which is sometimes forgotten, though in the presence of Philip Orr here, we can't forget it because he's written so movingly about its experiences, is the 10th Irish Division, who are the first to join up in some ways and the first to see action. And they don't see action. It's not Belgium or France, but elsewhere. No, I've overrun myself slightly. Here's a postcard from the autumn of 1914, got in. And quite interestingly, I always assumed that this, with this cod Irish accent, that this is assumed to be an Irish nationalist. And in fact, I'm not sure it is. It could as readily be an Ulster Unionist who, remember, are gearing up to fight potentially traitorously against an English-British government whom they think are going to sell them down the river. And so, in fact, it could be either. I mean, this might be an English person's vision of Ireland, and we don't want to dwell on it. But it reminds us that there's a business opportunity for the postcard seller. This postcard was sent by a guy from Ballykinler, a man who survived the war, happily, who joined up in the Ulster Division. But the first guys who go, they go here. They go to Suvla Bay, to Gallipoli, that disastrous campaign in 1915, which was going to solve the war in one go. The engagement at Suvla, on that distant strand and that distant place, sometimes gets forgotten, and it ought not to be. But it led to that remarkable and poignant song, The Foggy Dew, written by a County Down man, Father or Canon O'Neill, in which that line, "'Twas better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sed El Bar," which takes you to another, of course, line of tension through the war. Here's an Irish fusilier in the trenches at Suvla. But the place, of course, which is remembered more abundantly and more committedly, if you like, in Ulster is here. This beautiful painting by an Irish painter, William Orpen, Dublin Protestant. The two of the greatest Irish painters of the early 20th century both paint the war in different ways. If you haven't, you must go upstairs. You probably have to come back when it's open and look at the laveries upstairs. There's a wonderful painting up there from my studio window in 1917, depicting a German air raid in London and the beautiful Hazel Lavery looking up in some anxiety at this. Well, Lavery never went to France during the war. In fact, he painted the home front. He goes to France in 1919, but Orpen goes in 1917, and he goes to the Somme battlefield, and he paints these extraordinary pictures. This is the Somme battlefield a year on. Here's a picture from the early days. The Battle of the Somme was thought to be a victory and a great triumph. Here are men of the 36th Ulster Division in a very typical kind of pose, and you look into the faces of these men and you wonder what had driven them there, what had impelled them to be there, and what on earth did they think they were doing once they got there. Here are men, however, of the 16th Irish Division. Now, this is the Nationalist Division, and they don't arrive in the Somme until September. And they have quite a successful time in September. They don't have that awful, appalling casualties to quite the same extent, which the Ulster Division suffer, of course, on the 1st of July. But you can see these guys have already collected a few trophies. There's two men in the front, three of them, wearing German Pickelhaubes, those classic German helmets. And so part of this narrative of the war, of course, takes us to the Western Front. And many of you perhaps have been there, and to those extraordinary and resonant and beautiful and sad cemeteries, which in that richer earth, a richer dust concealed in a faraway field that is forever, for these men, Ireland, and not England in the old Rupert Brooke words. Nevertheless, there are other places the war goes. Here we are, well, sinking ships. The Lusitania is torpedoed in May 1915. Nearly 1,200 die in this. And here's a propaganda poster or a recruiting poster. Join an Irish regiment. Here are civilians being killed. But on the Lusitania, there are 5 Newry men. 4 of them are firemen. They're in the bows of this ship. They go down with this ship. And it reminds us that it's not just soldiers who get involved in this. Indeed, these aren't sailors, these are civilians, these are merchant mariners. And part of the recovery, of the wonderful recovery of the history of those times, is embedded in the kinds of local history groups who are beginning to produce lists and explorations of local history. And I learned this is, I think, a particularly good one. It gives a listing of Newry's war day. This is for the First and Second World War, but it draws its selection as widely as possible, so that you have nurses, you have civilians, and you have these 5 sailors. I mean, seaports, get hit by this. There's a Newry ship goes down, I think, in 1917, and there are at least 2 sets of brothers on the boat, and you get these clusters of people, which are very characteristic of the 1st of July, people who knew each other, and you can spot them, and in battles on the Western Front, but it takes us further away. And of course, the war also influences the home front. Indeed, the whole concept of the home front is a result of the First World War. Here are women in Lambkin's, a tobacco factory in Cork, packing cigarettes for the troops. There they are to go. They didn't seem to come with a health warning in those days, and perhaps that's understandable. Here's a drawing by William Connor, Connor Cafe across the road here, which you can visit. It used to be a studio of a woman called Madeline Ewart at Mackey's, engaged in making munitions here in West Belfast, and a new experience for many of these people, drawing them out of the private sphere and into new and unexpected places. This is from Dublin, a picture from the Post Office archives of a post office, and allegedly, or so the caption tell us, these are separation women waiting for the post office to open to get their payments. And separation women received, as it were, family allowances for their dependents, husbands, sometimes sons, and who made up their income and was paid directly to these women. And these are women who perhaps had money in their hands as of right for the first time. They didn't have to wait on their man coming back, on a Friday night. They got it directly, and it empowered them in interesting and new ways. There was a whole narrative of how many of them, spent it on drink, and women couldn't, of course, handle this. Assertions of that sort, but for the great majority of these ordinary people, now that's a term I don't much like, but these people who are not exceptional in any ways, they're every man and every woman here. And you look again in these faces and you wonder what the stories are behind them. Some of them have left traces, and it's the obligation of us all, and historians like me, to try and recover those stories as well. And of course, the rising that comes to Dublin. Here's another picture. Again, this is the savings bank. But again, it's quite interesting, the vividness of these pictures of these anonymous people. They exist only in this photograph. but they live through these extraordinary events, and of course it influences their families and their stories. And the damage in Dublin is by many commentators likened to the damage done on the Western Front. Ypres on the Liffey. Said one newspaper, and which suggests that the First World War battlefields extend not just to Gallipoli, not just to the Western Front, but reached home as well in a very specific way. And all of this is part of a seamless robe of history, which we are coming to, I think, revisit in very important ways in the future. And now. And then there are all these monuments that exist about the place. I play games with people who are supposed to shout out and tell us where these are, because sometimes you pass by these sites without really looking at them. There's a very interesting book by a distinguished cultural historian called Jay Winter, which he calls Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning. And he takes this from a French school of history, which focus in on the lieux de mémoire, the places of memory. And these become very important sites where people, and the rituals around them, now sometimes they're very politicized, but they become a place because the soldiers are buried where they fall, because they lie in those foreign fields. There is no grave to visit, or grave to visit easily. Many of us, I was the first of my family to visit the graves of my great-uncles in France over the past 20 years, and in fact there have been, increasing trips and journeys to the Western Front of people making those journeys for the first time. In the 1920s, this wasn't possible. And it may be that the only place you could come to is the War Memorial to reflect on your loss, a kind of surrogate grave. And what the War Memorials tell us, like the one in Cork, they also embody some ideas of what the war was about. Now, this is Banbridge, and Banbridge is actually very interesting and extremely unusual because you've got a soldier cheering for the end of the war. Is it relief that he's come home alive? And is that appropriate? Is it victory? We've won. And that's a kind of thing that we don't celebrate anymore. It's not thought appropriate. Don't mention the war. These are all inclusive. But unless you understand some of the emotions of the time, we will not fully understand what was going on then as now. But there are very, very few memorials like this across the world that I have seen. Most of them, what the Australians call sad diggers, soldiers in mourning, with arms reversed, heads down, and there are a number of those in the province. And of course, they're not just in the south. This one's in Drogheda. It's been restored recently. This last 11th of November, the British ambassador came and laid a wreath in it. And there were moments in the past 30 years, many of them I should have thought, that such a thing could never imagine happening. But the place that these memorials is also interesting, these sites of memory. This memorial is between the barracks and the railway station. And every soldier who joined up in Dundalk or Drogheda and goes to the barracks marched past that spot. And that's why the memorial is where it is. And it's that kind of local history that gives you the depth and the feel and the texture of the times as well. And the most recent one, or the nearest one, is this one down at Queen's, which is, of course, a very grand memorial. But there are stories to be extracted from these, to breathe life into these inanimate objects. So, we've got an extraordinary experience that falls across of Europe and Ireland in those 4.5 years between 1914 and 1918. And we've got the challenge, and I think the way that increasingly we're being able to gauge this is with the micro stories, the individual stories of valor, of endurance, of cowardice as well, of aggressiveness, and of people searching peace through those awful events, of families under strain, but it touches everyone. And so I will leave you with this image and encourage you all to recover as you can your family history and look again in your cupboards in the hope that you might find one of those blessed, wonderful treasure troves of records which bring back to us and renew our interest in that extraordinary period. Thank you. There we go.